Thank you for listening to this episode of History Exchange.
Danke, dass Sie wieder dabei sind bei dieser Episode von History Exchange.
Further information can be found on Center Austria's homepage www.centeraustria.org.
Und auf der Homepage des Instituts für Zeitgeschichte der Universität Innsbruck www.uibk.ac.at/Zeitgeschichte.
Welcome to today's episode of History Exchange. We are Luise Pesenhofer and I'm joined by my colleague
Christian Konz. Today is November 15th and we are joined by our guests Professor Marc Landry and Gertraud Griessner from the University of New Orleans. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Before we start our conversation, we would like to introduce our guests to our listeners.
Marc Landry is an associate professor of history and director of Austrian Marshall Plan Center for European Studies. He holds a PhD in history and MA in German and European Studies from Georgetown University, as well as a BA in history from the College of William and Mary. He joined the University of New Orleans in 2017 as an assistant professor and associate director of the Austrian Marshall Plan Center for European Studies. Previously, he held positions at Utah State University and has been a Fulbright Botzeber visiting professor at the University of Innsbruck, where he has maintained a long-standing connections since his undergraduate study abroad experience. Professor Landry is an environmental historian, focusing on the environmental history of modern Europe, particularly Central Europe. His research examines the environmental impacts of industrialization and the two world wars on European landscapes, with a specific interest in hydroelectric developments in the Alps. He recently completed a book manuscript, Mountain Battery, The Alps, Water and Power in the Fossil Fuel Age, which analyzes how hydroelectricity transformed Alpine region. Furthermore, his research has been supported by various fellowships, such as the German Exchange Service and the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers. Born in Salzburg, Austria, Gertraud Griessner studied English and Spanish at the University of Innsbruck. She has been the program coordinator for Center Austria in New Orleans and has been the heart of Center Austria, the Austrian Marshall Plan Center for European Studies, since its founding in 1997. Known for her dedication and personal approach, she has played a key role in internationalizing UNO, especially through organizing the student exchange with the University of Innsbruck, which now brings 70 to 80 students to UNO each year. Beyond managing logistics, Gertraud is a mentor and friend to students, supporting them both academically and personally. In addition to that, she has served as the secretary of UNO's International Summer School in Innsbruck over the past 7 years, and has significantly contributed to the continued success of the program. Among other things, Gertraud Griessner plays an important role for the model partnership between UNO and University of Innsbruck, especially because of her dedication to the students and the faculty.
Before we start talking about Center Austria, we would like to take the opportunity of talking to an Austrian who has lived in the US for a long time and an American who has spent quite some time in Austria and in Europe to ask about your perspective on the two countries and their connection.
It's an interesting question. I'll start, I guess, with my experiences. The first time that I went to Austria, it was to Innsbruck in the fall of 2000, and I went as a exchange student from the University of New Orleans. So I was actually part of what was called the academic year abroad, and I spent a full 2 semesters in Innsbruck. And I hadn't met Gertraud yet because I was not a UNO student, but I found the program because it had a national reputation and one of my professors suggested it to me. So that was over 20 years ago, and that was my first time. I grew up in Vermont. So it is also a place in the north. We don't really have mountains, but hills, and we have a ski culture that has been influenced a lot by Austrians. The Von Trapp family in particular also built cross-country ski trails. And so that was one reason that I wanted to go to Austria. I wanted to learn German because I thought I would like to become a historian of German-speaking Europe. But I also wanted to do it in a place where there were mountains, where there was snow. And so for me, there were some similarities there when I arrived in Innsbruck, although, of course, the Alps are much higher than the Green Mountains of Vermont. And so that really started my experience with Austria and Innsbruck. I liked it so much, I really tried to get back there, and I managed to get a Fulbright student grant to go after I graduated from my undergrad. And that really put me on the path to eventually doing Austrian history, really learning the language and doing historical research over there. So in terms of similarities and differences, I mean, there's a lot, of course, but a lot of differences too. So the landscapes were familiar to me. I think culturally, I noticed a lot of differences between Innsbruck, Austria, and the United States. I was very impressed, I have to say, with things like public transportation, how well that worked over in Austria, and conversely, not as well in the United States, a much more car-focused consumer culture. And yeah, I mean, it's hard to, there's so many things I could talk forever, but I'll just sort of, conclude by saying, for me, one of the attractions of Austria was that there is a cultural similarity there in terms of the mountain landscapes and that kind of mountain culture that I grew up in.
Maybe what I can say for me is that I came to New Orleans because I met my future husband in Innsbruck at the university, and he was in Innsbruck for an exchange semester as a Fulbright lecturer. And so we met, and the relationship progressed. And so I said, okay, well, I'll come to New Orleans and see if I like it. I have been to the States before, just into New Orleans for 2 or 3 days, and I only can remember how immensely hot it was when I first came. When I came to live here, I liked New Orleans immediately because I was young and we didn't have a family, no kids. And New Orleans, in comparison to where I come from Léogâne, which is a very small town. Oh, it's not even a town. It's a very small village, and everybody knows everybody, and everybody knows everybody's business. And in New Orleans, that was just not the case. People they lived, and I had the impression that they let everybody else live, and my neighbors didn't care if I came home, when I came home, all the things that in Léogâne, could make the news, so to speak, in the village. So the differences between Léogâne and, to me, in Innsbruck and New Orleans were just huge. And I really enjoyed that. It was this, the New Orleans motto of laissez beau temps rouler, let the good times roll. I thought when I came here first, I was 25, I thought that was fantastic. And then I just also really embraced all the differences. I had never in my life seen a crawfish before. When we talk about food, I didn't really miss the winters the first couple of years either. And so I became, I would say, of course, that Léogâne in Austria is always my home, but I became a convinced New Orleanian when I first came here.
Thank you for sharing your perspectives and also your personal connections to both places. I think it's very interesting hearing it from both sides. The podcast series that we're producing our part in today is being produced in honor of Günther Bischof's retirement. We ask you to share your connection to Günther Bischof, so how you first met him and how you got to work with him.
Gertraud, why don't you start? Because I think at least chronologically, you knew him before I did, and as a historian, I like to have that possible.
That's right. When I came to New Orleans, there was a very small group. I would say 2 or 3 Austrians at the time who were living in New Orleans, and they were all connected to the University of New Orleans because at the time, the UNO's history department and the history department in Innsbruck and also the Amerikanistik had an exchange where graduate students from Innsbruck would come to UNO history department for a year and become graduate assistants. Well, Günther Bischof was the first such graduate assistant who ever came. And then Günther, of course, decided to stay because he was accepted into Harvard. And then when Günther came back to the University of New Orleans as a member of the history department, he, of course, never forgot his relationship with the University of Innsbruck. And when the activities between the universities got to be so different in the sense that on one side there was the summer school program, but then there started to be a student exchange and a faculty exchange, it was decided that maybe the other activities other than the summer school also needed a place where all these activities could be sort of directed in one place. And that was supposed to be Center Austria. And at the time, the people in Center Austria were Dr. Nick Mueller, who was the director, and then Günther Bischof. Günther at the time was executive director. And then there was also Dr. Margaret Davidson, who was going to be, she moved to Innsbruck, and she was the academic director for the academic year abroad program, the program that Marc went on as a student. So it was these three people that started Center Austria. But Günther, when Center Austria started, was an exchange in Salzburg, so he wasn't here. Margaret had moved to Innsbruck, so she wasn't here. And Nick Mueller was busy getting the World War II Museum off the ground, so he was mostly not here. So they needed somebody to sort of hold down the fort. And because Günther knew me, and I had just, my daughter was 2 years old, and Günther knew I was wanting to get back into working, he asked me if I could be that person. And I said yes. So I started at Center Austria when it was officially kind of open in the fall of 1997 as the person who would be sort of the administrative person in the office while the professors were, doing their various other obligations. So
Oh, go ahead, Gertraud, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, and that's how long I have known Günther, as I said, first as a friend, as a fellow Austrian in town, and then, as my executive director in Center Austria.
Yeah, I just want to say, so I guess I did not meet Günther Bischof until comparatively late, but I heard of him first. And so I guess when I first heard of him would have been a few years after Center Austria started. So when I did the academic year abroad in Innsbruck, that was the fall of 2000. And as Gertraud mentioned, that was run in Innsbruck by Dr. Margaret Davidson. And I can't recall, it was so long ago, I can't recall if it was through her or some of the other New Orleans students that were there in Innsbruck with me, part of this program, taking classes. But it was sort of almost legendary hearing about this Professor Günther Bischof and some of the history courses that he was offering in New Orleans. And, at that time I was an undergraduate. And so I hadn't come across that name, but I just remember even back then sort of being impressed. Well, this must be a great teacher. He was definitely, talked about in Innsbruck. But I never met him when I was in Innsbruck. I sort of went along and began my PhD studies, wanting to do a topic, an environmental history focused on the Alps. As I said, I had this interest in mountains and sort of the relationship between mountains and history. And it was at that point that I started to come across Günther's name a lot more in scholarship, and particularly connected to the Marshall Plan, which I was interested in terms of how the U.S. Marshall Plan affected Austria's ability to finance and build major dam projects after the Second World War. And so I began looking at the Marshall Plan in terms of its environmental history and allowing this huge transformation of the alpine environment and the shift in Austria's energy use. And that's when I came up across his name in very, very important articles for my dissertation. I did not meet Günther until I think it was 2012. The AHA was in New Orleans at the American Historical Association. They have an annual meeting somewhere in the United States where all historians working in the United States or working on the United States come together. It's our largest meeting. And I was on a panel talking about the Alps, and Günther was, of course, there. He's the type of person that, he looks and finds and sees what sorts of scholarship is being done in areas that he's interested in. And so I met him at that point. And it wasn't until I came to UNO in 2017 that I really got to know Günther better, working as associate director with him here in Center Off. But yeah, so it started as a legend, and then I finally got to meet him many years later.
Thank you for your insights, which also lead me to my next question. How would you, Gertraud, describe Günther Bischof as a person and you, Marc, as a historian?
Thank you, Chris. I can say honestly that I have seen Günther in action, the legend in action, as Marc rightfully points out, for 2 decades, because we did, when he was in Center Austria, I could just see how he worked and what ideas he was pursuing in terms of for the activities for the center, not so much as his scholarship and a historian, but more in his role as the executive director and then the director. And 2 things always stand out to me. One is Günther's immense work ethic. I don't know how many times we would get, and when I say we, at the time, we would have Innsbruck students in our office who were graduate assistants who helped out, emails from Günther at 5:00 in the morning, where he had already been up since 4 and gone through his email, and he was ready to start the day. And we came in at 8 something, and then we already had our list of things to do from Günther. And that has never changed. Günther he was always incredibly hardworking. And so in that regard, I think he was an enormous role model for everybody who was connected to the center, because it was just, you wouldn't goof off when you knew that Günther was working really hard doing his thing. And the second thing really, and the most impressive to me, is also just his intellect. I mean, it's amazing what he knows, how smart he is, but also I want to say his intellectual curiosity. I mean, I can say we've had lots and lots of Center Austria talks in our office, and they weren't always great, and they were all sometimes niche topics. And you would say, wow, what is this about? But Günther, at every presentation that I've seen him, he always paid attention. You could tell he was thinking with the presentation, and then you could always see in his questions afterwards that he was really interested and curious, and whether that was a topic that had to do with history or other subjects. It was just amazing to me, the connections that he made while presentations were going on. So his intellectual curiosity to me has always been astounding. And maybe thirdly, what I also always impressed me, and the thing that I will remember about Günther, is that when he came to students, we had many, many students either from Innsbruck or students in his classes, and they were always wondering what they should do, or where should they apply to, what colleges, or what they should do with their life. And Günther really emphasized that people should give it a shot. And I think that comes from being, also from a small town in Vorarlberg, where he went to Harvard and then thought, well, if I could do it, you could do it too. And so he gave us all this sort of sense that, yeah, why shouldn't I try it? Why shouldn't an Austrian in the States apply to the top schools? And he always would give the people the sense, sure, you should try it. And then I think that gave people an enormous ego boost. If Dr. Bischof, the legend, says you should apply, then people thought, look, maybe I should, So I would say these 3 things: his intellect, his intellectual curiosity, his immense work ethic, and then his sense that sort of the American side, why not you? This sense of instilling confidence in his students. Those are the 3 things for me.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear, Gertraud, because you touch on some points that I also agree with. And so I'll kind of try to, shape my answer to reflect that. But yeah, in terms of how he works as a historian, I'm eventually going to focus on what I've seen from Günther as a historian working with students, because to me, that's maybe a perspective that not everybody has, and one that stuck out to me the most. But first, I'll just say, as a historian, I've been really impressed with Günther's, as Gertraud mentioned, the intellectual curiosity, and that sort of shows and is manifested in how he's changed as a historian over time. So he's a diplomatic historian, but he's somebody who was always interested, I think, in exploring new questions and trying different approaches to history, right? So he has done a lot with the history of memory. He has done a lot with, immigrants and immigrant histories. And so that to me was always very impressive, that he ranged beyond, sort of his initial interests and had that kind of intellectual curiosity. But, what I want to emphasize, I think, in terms of Günther as a historian is kind of what Gertraud was touching on, which is I got to see him as a historian working with students here, working with master's students at the University of New Orleans, but also undergrads. And what I was really struck by was his generosity in helping these young scholars. And where that really showed up, I mean, he served on so many thesis committees as supervisor or as a member, and he really worked to help students improve their own scholarship. So that meant you could send Günther a chapter or a draft of your thesis, and probably within 2 days, you would have that returned to you with comments and with feedback. And that to me really stood out. I think he is really, as Gertraud mentioned, he's interested in everything. And so he wanted to read that. He wanted to learn what people were up to. And, I guess it goes beyond students as well. I can say from my own perspective, I have been able to send Günther drafts of my chapters, of my essays. And it's the same thing. Very quickly, you get really helpful feedback. I've watched him do this with other scholars, working on their first books. They'll send him drafts, and it's just, you can count on him getting back to you. So it's really easy to point to. I mean, he's published so many articles. He's been doing contemporary Austrian studies. So obviously a very productive historian in his own right. But what stood out to me is sort of his willingness and eagerness to help other people with their work.
Yeah, we've heard that in a few interviews that he's been very adamant about young people in sciences and in history and helping them further their research. And so, yeah, it's nice that both of you point that out as well, how he was adamant about young people and supporting them. Maybe as a last question about Günther, is there any special memory or any memory that comes to mind when you think of him?
Maybe not one particular situation, but I think that when people at UNO saw Günther, they always saw the eminent historian. The older he got, the whiter he got in his hair. And so he even looked more the part. And he was, especially for the students from Innsbruck, he was very approachable. And that meant for all the students, not just in the history department, but from Innsbruck, we have students, who are mostly in business, so all kinds of other subjects. And here was maybe the first time they ever got that close to a Universitätsprofessor, where in Austria, the distance between professor and student can be pretty big. Günther was always extremely approachable, and I think in that regard a different experience for our students. But mostly what they did see was a super smart, super busy, super hardworking professor, until Günther would invite the whole office crew out to La Rose, where he and his family live, for a get-together. And then you saw the Günther Bischof that lets down his hair a little bit. And you saw how much he likes to cook. And I always said he was like a little bio farmer, grow his own veggies and like to sit down and have a long lunch. And those are the things that normally you wouldn't see in the office because he was always too busy. So that side of him, I think, always was nice because it kind of gave him that human touch. You know, you have a long lunch and then you take a nap. And so I think that's something we could all relate to. Whereas in the office, it was, mostly the university professor, and you better get your stuff done. So there are kind of these two sides of Günther. One that is hardworking and a professor, and the other one then is somebody who can kick back and have a lot of fun and enjoy his beer or his wine with a good meal that he cooks.
Yeah, that's sort of the same thing. So, what Gertraud's talking about, Günther regularly has people out to his house in the bayou of Louisiana. And so that's included also my family. So I should also say, I when I went back to Innsbruck following my academic year abroad, I was living in the Internationale Studentenheim, which is where I lived the first time I went there. And I met a woman from South Tyrol who eventually became my wife. So, in some ways, this Innsbruck connection that Günther and Gertraud have been so responsible in creating, among others, Nick Mueller, Margaret Davidson, so many people to mention here. But, in some ways that also not only influenced my career, but my family life. And so when we got to New Orleans, Günther knew that I had a wife from South Tyrol and two young kids. And so they would invite us out to the bayou. And usually we would help pick turnips in particular, because he has this, you got to imagine this really large fields behind his house where they grow crops, and you need to harvest the turnips. And so like a memory that I think that I'll always have is of, the whole group, Günther, his family, Gertraud, other people involved in Center Austria, but my kids out in the fields picking turnips. I had never done that before. And then, so that's a really, a memory that will stick out to me.
Let's switch to our primary talking point, the Center Austria at the University of New Orleans, which was officially opened in 1997 as a means to organize the long-standing collaboration between the University of Innsbruck and the University of New Orleans.
You talked a little bit about how or who founded it, but what are generally the main objectives of the Center Austria and also the collaboration between the two universities? Maybe both of you can say a little bit about that, maybe also chronologically. We'll start with Gertraud.
As I said in the beginning, that the office was meant to bring under one umbrella all the growing activities between the University of Innsbruck and between the University of New Orleans that came out of the summer school. I think I also said before that in order to have such a long-standing relationship between two institutions, it needs people who support these ideas and these plans. And I think very fortunately on both sides, both from Innsbruck and at the University of New Orleans, there was always leadership who recognized that this is a special relationship that, we call it, we have a friendship treaty that these two institutions, as hokey as it might sound, really are friends. And that doesn't happen just because you decide to sign a friendship treaty. It's a living relationship. And so what I remember is that both sides had a dedicated professor, dedicated and chosen from the rector of Innsbruck on the Innsbruck side and the president from the UNO side, who were, quote unquote, in charge of these partnership activities. And so in Innsbruck, it was, when I started, it was still Professor Turney, who at that time was sort of the foreign minister of the University of Innsbruck. He was in charge of all the international programs that had. And then when Professor Turney retired, it went to Professor Franz Mattis, who was in the history department. And so it went on. And on the UNO side, it was first Dr. Nick Mueller. And when Dr. Mueller moved over, because he became the president of the World War II Museum, it was Günther who stepped into that role. And since Günther's retirement, it's Marc who is on the UNO side in charge of all the activities that the center does. And at the time, I think that there was a lot of work that both sides had to put in order to plan the activities, whether that be joint conferences or joint publications, and who would contribute how much money so that these activities could be carried out, but also all kinds of questions about faculty exchanges that these were possible, and then of course student exchanges too. And we really saw that what a difference it made when two institutions are partners is, to my mind, when we had a Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and we had 40-some students from Innsbruck here, and we also had a visiting professor from Graz. In Innsbruck, the university sent somebody, Elke Kitzelmann at the time. They sent Elke to Houston so she could coordinate where the Innsbruck students were, because the rest of us, we were busy with our families. We were evacuated. We didn't know whether we could come back. So the university sent somebody to help out. And then in Innsbruck, the university and various people at the time, for instance, Ellen Pali from political science at the time, they knew how devastated the city was and how much of the UNO community has lost houses. So they started to collect money. And then I think they did a benefit, and the proceeds from that also went to UNO faculty and staff who lost houses. So there was an incredible outpouring of generosity in real times of need. And it just showed everybody here that, when the going gets tough, that the partners on the other side are there. And I just think that was phenomenal to see from me from a point of view from Center Austria. I'll let Marc talk to the rest of the Center Austria, or not the rest, but the Center Austria agenda, because he knows better.
Well, I'm not sure I have the same institutional memory, but I'll give it a whirl anyhow. So yeah, I think, it's just Center Austria. We are coming up on 30 years of existence in a few more years. And I think it's a testament to the strength of the partnership that we have with Innsbruck. And so, we have a few things going on, sort of pillars, I would say, of Center Austria. Student and faculty exchange, and then we have a lot of research programs. But in terms of the student exchange, that is maybe the most unique thing about Center Austria. We have worked with Innsbruck, of course, but to bring over hundreds of Austrian or Innsbruck students over to study in New Orleans for a semester and for sometimes a year. So I think that's really special. We also have worked with Innsbruck to allow for regular faculty exchange. So Innsbruck faculty coming over and New Orleans going to Innsbruck. Since the founding of Center Austria, we've also become one of 9 so-called Austrian centers worldwide. And these are centers with, government backing in Vienna from Austria. These are in all different places, different universities. In North America, there are centers at the University of Minnesota, at Berkeley in California, in Alberta, and then us in New Orleans. Then there are a few in Europe and at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem as well. And so what sets us apart from the other Austrian centers is definitely our student exchange. We are really the only center that has a program like that on that scale. In terms of our research activity, again, this depends on the relationship with Innsbruck, but we run regular conferences, joint conferences between Innsbruck and New Orleans, usually switching sites from year to year. We have been jointly publishing a volume called Contemporary Austrian Studies, which is now in its 34th edition this fall. So that's really, I think, a tremendous success to keep going over some decades, really. And of course, we have all kinds of lectures and talks and you name it. So I think that really is what defines Center Austria is both this student exchange and these regular research activities that really live from the relationship with Innsbruck.
You kind of answered our next question already, so let me think of something on the fly. How do you think has the center and also your work impacted the perception of Austria and Europe, such a small country, changed over the years?
That's a good question. I mean, it's in general, I would say the center is one part of Austria's presence in New Orleans, that I've come to see since I arrived here in 2017. But, together with the summer school, which is approaching its 50th anniversary. So that's another amazing milestone, a 50-year transatlantic partnership through things like global pandemics and the like. That's really impressive. But, here in New Orleans, the Austria and Innsbruck are known because of the summer school and because of Center Austria. I have had the experience of being out at playgrounds, standing around while my children run around and hoping they don't injure themselves, that you talk to somebody and you find out that they went to Innsbruck on the summer school or they know people. And so I don't think that would exist. It would not exist without this long partnership of which Center Austria is just an aspect. But it really has it's become a part of New Orleans culture. And that's pretty amazing to think. I would like to think, that Center Austria in particular, we see it as our mission. We're a Center for Austrian European Studies with support from the Austrian Marshall Plan Foundation. We see it as part of our mission to bring knowledge of Austrian politics and culture over to New Orleans. So we hold regular events and lectures in which we're trying to spread the word about Austria. And so I think that has had some impacts as well. I'll give you an example. We have a Deutsches Haus here in New Orleans, which is a club for people with German heritage or really anybody that wants to be involved. But, we have regular activities with them, and they've started doing things such as holding a Viennese ball for New Year's Eve celebrations, right? And, I think it things like that doesn't exist everywhere. And so it's things like these that make an impact that goes beyond the university. Gertraud, did you have any thoughts?
Maybe to me, the impact that I feel is that our relationship with Innsbruck and with Austria kind of helps to internationalize our campus. And I think I want to put this in context. We are a public urban university in the Deep South, which means that lots of our students have never been outside of the country because they just don't have the means and it's far away. It's not like in Innsbruck, or in Austria where you don't have to go very far and you're already at the border to another country. So our students are not, by and large, I want to say worldly. So I always feel like the relationship with Innsbruck and with Austria brings the world a little bit closer to them because the Innsbruck students sit in classes with the UNO students, or we have visiting professors who teach students. Then this might be the first time or the only time that UNO students ever had a professor who's not from the States. And so that brings a different perspective and makes them hopefully a little bit more open and see the world from a different angle. And I know for sure on campus, I know professors who I know, and they tell me, "Oh, I have one of the Innsbruck students in my class, and you can see the students in the gym, and they enrich the campus by bringing an international aspect to the classrooms and to life here that our students not always, they don't always have that because we're just geographically a little bit far removed, and our students don't always have the funds to spend a semester abroad. So I always feel good about that. I think Center Austria and having the Innsbruck relationship makes our university a little bit more, international.
Thank you for sharing that. We talked a lot about the how developed, what the objectives are, and also what maybe personal connections it has brought about. What are some of the future developments of the Center Austria and some of the goals that are you still want to pursue with this collaboration?
I'll let you give a serious answer. I never thought of myself that I would like to meet Arnold Schwarzenegger. And over the last couple of years, I've had it in my mind that I want to bring Arnold Schwarzenegger to campus. On a more serious note, because he's now an elder statesman who cares about the environment and what the world does, he's becoming kind of like a little bit more relatable to me. So my personal goal, and I hope for the center, is that we could get Arnold Schwarzenegger to come to UNO. I'm going to try my darndest to make that happen. But I'll let Marc answer the rest of the question, please.
Well, as director, I wholeheartedly endorse that. I've written, I think I can remember writing letters trying to get Arnold Schwarzenegger's people to maybe come down to UNO. And, while we're on that subject, a basketball fan, I'm a sports fan in general. And I've been thinking about writing there's an Austrian basketball player in the NBA, Jakob Poeltl. So I also want to get him here at some point. I don't know if that will be feasible, but in all seriousness, I think the Arnold Schwarzenegger suggestion does play into something that I sort of see as the future. So I think Center Austria, of course, I want to continue so many of these things that I think have become, like I said, pillars of Center Austria to strengthen the student exchange going forward. Our research activities in contemporary Austrian studies are important. But, I have a slightly different, compared to Günther, interests, I guess, in terms of history. And, I'm an environmental historian. And so one of the things I'm really passionate about, interested in, is questions of sustainability. I think environmental issues are among the most pressing and important of our time, particularly with global warming. Clearly a reality. We're already in the midst of it. It's not something that's off in the distant future. And here in New Orleans, we feel the effects of global warming constantly, particularly during the summers when it's hurricane season. And, there have supposedly hurricane season is supposed to be over. But since then, we've had 2 hurricane type storms in the Gulf. They have not thankfully come yet to here, but all this is to say, I think environmental issues and questions of sustainability are going to be really the main questions of our time. So I that is kind of my focus. And I see then the relationship with Austria as room for trying to bring ideas in Austria that I think are a little farther along in terms of sustainability, try to bring them over here. I think that we have a real chance to learn from Austria and from Innsbruck in things like public transportation, in energy efficiency, and you name it. There's so many things. And so going forward, that's going to be something I really focus on, is trying to use the connection that we have to Innsbruck in Austria to advance the goal of sustainability over here.
That's definitely an interesting aspect also in light of future developments and the very present climate crisis. Also, in addition to other athletes, there's also an Austrian in the NFL, if you want to look into that.
I think I was hearing that. What's the name?
Reimann. I think it's Reimann, but I'm not 100% sure. Yeah. I think for the end, Vienna. No, but just adding to the sports aspect. But I think especially the future developments will be interesting to see. I think we have one last question, if I'm not mistaken. You've talked about a lot of changes and also what the future might hold. What do you think will maybe also change and influence Central Austria and generally the collaboration between European city, country, and city and university in the US in light of recent events? Maybe
I'll go first. I think the election of Donald Trump is a very concerning issue, just from the standpoint of democracy in the United States. I think it's very concerning that someone who participated in the attempted overthrow of a election and a transition of power was put back in office. I think that's extremely concerning. And I think it raises questions about, the transatlantic partnership or foreign relations in general. But what I would say is that it only makes having sort of these international partnerships more important. To maybe bring it back to the climate crisis and environmental issues, those are also things that cannot be solved by one country alone. It's going to require international cooperation. So I think things like Center Austria, things like the partnership between UNO and the University of Innsbruck are more important than ever. And I think we will continue to uphold this relationship and promote it. And so I think that's a positive and encouraging thing going forward. I think in general, we're seeing in both countries, you could say, concerning political developments. These are maybe also globally part of a global trend in some ways. But I just think it's important to keep international dialogues open, exchange open, and we're going to continue to do that.
Yeah, it's exactly the same. I couldn't agree with Mark anymore. I think it's now and going forward the next couple of years more important than ever that we continue these relationships, that we continue, as a center, as Mark had outlined the priorities, that we continue that, and also personally, I think it's important to bring students from Innsbruck here. I think it's important to bring students from the States to Innsbruck and to Austria, because I am firmly convinced that on a more personal level, it is important that we are able at some point to talk about how these elections, and as Mark said, not just here but also in Europe, what that means, what we can do. And so an international partnership is more important than ever, I feel.
For your answers, to sort of conclude the part of the interview about the center, you've both been at the center for quite a long time. Gertraud, you've been with the center since its inception, and Marc, you've also been at the center for almost 8 years. When you think about all this time, what is the most vivid memory? What is the most interesting thing you could witness in all your time at the center?
Yes, I have been here for a long time. As Günther would say, I'm Urgestein. Günther always also made fun of me because I was the one who unofficially kept track of the interpersonal relationships that came out of this relationship. So I have a list that says who married whom and how many kids and over the years. And Günther was always laughing at me. And I said, no, that's important. We have to know who's that. And so, of course, Mark and his family are on there. For me personally, I would like to make this a little bit personal in the end. I remember that after I worked here for 1 year, my dean at the time asked me, so do you like your job? I said, yeah, I like it a lot. I came home and told my husband that my dean had asked me how I like my job. And my husband said, well, he should have asked me. You're much easier to get along with now that you work there, because I have daily contact with my language, my people, my culture. So I'm a lot less homesick than I was when I wasn't working here. And I would think that is the side of the friendship that, you can't, we can't write a book about it. You can't summarize it and say an article or a book, but the immense personal relationships that go into a partnership like that, I think that's very unique, and I don't know how many universities have that. Have a list of how many students visited and how many. We used to have an alumni club in Innsbruck where students who were at UNO got together. I know that we still have a group of students who were here in 2007. They celebrate Thanksgiving together, and they all met here. So it's a living thing. This partnership in Center Austria is changing and growing in the sense that we go away from more diplomatic history now to environmental history, which I think makes good sense. We always, there's always new friendships. And to me personally, that means there's new hope and there's a future. And I hope it goes on for a long time, long past me.
Yeah, wow, that's a good hard question because there's so many great memories, and it doesn't always have to be just sort of a big event, but just like Gertraud said, for me it's great that I can walk into the office and Gertraud is there and students are there speaking dialect and there's a vibrant little piece of Austria or Innsbruck in right here in New Orleans. So that's great. But I guess I will focus, one sort of really great kind of event that does stand out in my mind is when we celebrated our 20th anniversary Center Austria. We had a big celebration here in New Orleans. And one of the things that Gertraud and Günther organized as part of the celebration was a second line through the French Quarter. And this was, I think, maybe 6 months after I'd arrived here. So for those of you that don't know what a second line is, I wasn't aware so much either. But in New Orleans, it is common practice if there is something to celebrate, that you will just go out into the streets and basically parade and dance with a brass band to celebrate whatever that you're interested in. Sometimes these things happen very spontaneously. We organized ours a little bit in advance. But essentially what that amounted to was, people from Center Austria, partners from Innsbruck. We kind of danced and paraded our way through the French Quarter with this brass band. And that was something I'd never experienced in my life. And I just think it's kind of a neat symbol of the connection, the very strange connection, right? In some ways you say, why does this exist? New Orleans, Innsbruck. There's a history. It's somewhat random and coincidental, but it's created something that is really great. So that's what sticks out in my mind.
Both are great memories, and also I like the idea that there's always a future and hope. So I think that was a very nice sentiment or thought. And you kind of we always talked about this connection between Austria and the US, or Austria and New Orleans. And now we would like to end the interview by asking you about your favorite food. So, Gertraud, maybe you can share your favorite food from the US that you that you learned to love since you've been living there. And Marc, maybe you can share your favorite Austrian or Tyrolean dish, or vice versa, maybe also the food that you miss the most when you're not there. So
for me, it definitely is seafood, but in particular, I do like crawfish. I have learned how to peel crawfish. I love a crawfish boil, which means this is a Louisiana tradition where you boil crawfish and then you stand around at a very big table and somebody dumps, 30 pounds of crawfish on the table, and everybody stands around and starts peeling the crawfish and eating a potato and drinking a beer. I do like crawfish. I know how to cook crawfish. I can make a crawfish pasta. I can make a crawfish pie. I still have to learn how to make a crawfish bread. So I like my crawfish. When I go home, when I fly to Innsbruck or Salzburg, the first thing I do is I have a coffee and I have a Topfengulatschen because I can't get that here. And then I have a Ballwürstel and a Semmel, and that makes me happy. So not very refined, but that's what I like. Mark, and you?
Yeah, well, I'll kind of answer all questions. So, I'm from Vermont. I think I mentioned I did not grow up in New Orleans, even though my last name, there's a lot of Cajun people in Louisiana that have the same last name, so people assume. But so for me, coming here was my first real exposure to seafood. Vermont is the only landlocked state in New England, so we have a big lake there and eat fish, but it's not part of the culture. So yeah, since I got here, I forced myself to eat crawfish and shrimp and oysters, and I actually like them. It's pretty good. In terms of Austrian or Tyrolean dishes, my wife is, I think, like Gertraud in that she really likes desserts and sweet things, and so one of the things that she too misses when living over here is just that wonderful range of desserts that exist in Austria. But I'm not so much of a suso. I like savory things more. So maybe this is kind of boring, but my favorite thing I think is really like just a very simple Speckbrot. I really like the Finsker Pal, that you take and just put some speck on there, a little bit of cheese, and warm it up with some pickles, and that to me is as tasty as it gets. So it's hard to get. You can't get a Finsker over here anyway, but good bread in general is a little harder to come by in the United States, and cheese as well. Speck we have in our supermarkets from time to time, but also not so easy to get. So that's what I always look forward to eating when I'm over in Tyrol. And then, of course, I'll just mention, now that I thought about it, in Sweet Tyrol, they have really good pizza, I have to say. So the pizza is also a highlight.
Oh, I just thought of something just in the not food, but what I miss so much is Austrian or the water that we have. It's unbelievable how delicious to me and to my kids too, to my family too. It is when you can just turn on the water and you take a big glass and it's the best water in the whole world. Our water here comes from the Mississippi River and has to be, aufbereitet. Can't think of the English word right now. So our water is not nearly as good as the water at home, certainly in Innsbruck and in Leogang.
Yeah, I mean, everybody in the United States essentially has a chance to dump stuff into the water that eventually we drink. And so it needs to be treated very heavily in New Orleans. So yeah, that's also a huge thing when you get to Austria in the summers, just drinking gallons of delicious tap water.
Yeah, that's something that we're generally very proud of. I think the water that everyone mostly mentions, or most people miss when they're not here. So I think I can agree with that.
Is there anything you would like to add? Is there anything we missed?
No, from my end, I think this was pretty comprehensive, Gertraud.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
I'm sorry, Mark.
You speak.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the interview and just a nice conversation. And goodbye to all the listeners from me.
Goodbye also from my side.
Danke fürs Dabeisein.
Thanks for listening. We hope you'll tune in to the next episode. More information can be found at Center Austria's website, www.centeraustria.org.
Und auf der Homepage des Instituts für Zeitgeschichte der Universität Innsbruck www.uibk.ac.at/Zeitgeschichte.